This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Church Street United Methodist Church proudly presents Rejoice.
Good morning and welcome to Rejoice, the weekly devotional program brought to you by Church Street United Methodist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. My name is Darryll Rasnake and I am pleased to be one of the pastors at Church Street. This morning, as we begin, we will read from Luke chapter 15, and so I invite you to take a moment and to get your Bible ready to read together. But first, let us listen together as our parish choir sings for us Agnus Dei from Requiem. Today we are continuing reading in Luke chapter 15, and today we begin with verse 11, the parable of the prodigal and his brother. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them." May God add a blessing to the reading of the Word and to our hearing. A recent article in Men's Health magazine, and yes, I do read that magazine, I just don't listen to a lot of it. It's entitled 6 Tricky Money Talks That Every Man Must Have. And that article states the obvious: money is a taboo topic in polite company and rarely even broached among friends. At home, conversations about the green stuff, the magazine says, can torpedo family harmony. In fact, a recent T. Rowe Price survey discovered that parents find it easier to talk to their kids about drugs and alcohol than about family finances. Why are we so touchy that way? Confrontations about financial success or failure, or even stray comments about spending habits, can put people on the defensive and make them feel judged, according to the magazine. And so accordingly, money chat number 2 that we need to have is, so how much am I going to inherit? According to the magazine, this is the Mac Daddy of all awkward money talks. So just be warned, writes the author, unless you've received explicit promises of the inheritance, you should not think that your parents' money is your own. Assume from the outset that you'll inherit nothing. There's a reason a will is read after death. It's like saying to your parents, "I wish you were dead." Which leads us to consider again this story, the beginning of this story about the prodigal son and the older son. I say again because most people are familiar with this favorite parable in Jesus' lexicon. We all know the outlines of the story: 2 sons, 1 father, a fortune squandered, a fatted calf, and a party invitation left unopened. But do we really know the story of what it's all about? We are in the midst of our Lenten study based on Kenneth Bailey's book, The Cross and the Prodigal, and the book takes an extended look at Luke chapter 15 and the story of the prodigal son. But long before this climactic return of the prodigal, the embittered response of the elder, and the impassioned plea of the father, there is this Mac Daddy of all awkward money talks. "I wish you were dead." There was a man, the Scripture says, who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "I wish you were dead." Well, not exactly, but that's what he really meant. He said, "Dad, give me the portion of property that falls to me," or "give me what I've got coming." Perhaps his father would have appreciated a more direct approach if the son had only said, "Give me my inheritance." 2 words in the language of that day, very simple, very easy. But instead, the soon-to-be prodigal works his way around a difficult conversation, something like this. He says, "Dad, can we talk about when I can have my stuff, the things that I deserve?" As Jesus tells the story, "Give me the share of the property that falls to me." So why the runaround? The word inheritance is never used in this passage, and that's the way that Jesus told the story. Elsewhere in Luke's Gospel and the rest of the New Testament, that word inheritance is frequently used. Inheritance, the goods and properties that pay off for all those years of being a good son. But to accept an inheritance goes far beyond money. It goes to responsibility. The money and the property are secondary to the duty that is explicit in taking responsibility for the entire family, and in caring for the old and the sick, and arbitrating over the family quarrels and the community disputes, and defending the family name and honor, and maintaining the most important family asset, the well-being of all. A heavy responsibility in our culture, but monumental in Jesus' day. To accept the inheritance is to build the house of the Father, the name of the family. So here, in Jesus' parable, we should not be surprised that the younger son asks for his ousia, the Greek word that means money or wealth or stuff, his share of property that can easily be turned into cash. Later on, the story tells us that he quickly disposed of the property, the ousia, and he left the country. And so in his commentary, Kenneth Bailey states what may not be obvious to our modern ears. A request for property means that the son was impatient for his father's death. It's like telling dear old dad, isn't it time for you to get on with the dying so I can get on with my living? But more than that, the younger son is telling his family that while he doesn't want them dead, he doesn't care if they die. To make such a grab for property is to imperil the family, to impoverish them without enough land, animals, or other resources to support the family. Prodigal doesn't seem to care how much others in the family will suffer because of what he demands. Not only will he hurt his father, but the entire family clan. The wealth of the family village was not in a bank somewhere, not in money stuffed in a mattress or an investment portfolio, but rather in the village itself, homes and animals and land. To suddenly lose 1/3 the younger son's rightful share would mean a staggering loss to the family. When the son liquidates his assets, a fire sale without the fire, the accumulated economic security of generations goes up in smoke. Rather than accepting the responsibility for the family, this son is actively working for the demise of his father, and we would assume his mother, his brother, and the rest of his family. And in cutting himself off, he cuts himself off from his roots and his true inheritance. The very inheritance he refused to ask for is now taken away. Because family is everything. Nothing else matters when it comes to Middle Eastern security. His family is his social security, as he will later realize, and his insurance and his old age pension and his future, his tie to family and to the land and to his father's house is lost in one little request. Bailey points out that in Middle Eastern cultures, last names didn't matter, only whose child you are and where you're from. When one person asks another where they are from, the real question is, who's your family? Where are your roots? What clan or people would claim you and defend you? Who do I have to worry about if I wrong you? The son belongs to his father's household. There he is accepted and loved completely and almost without condition. He is welcomed. All of this the younger son throws away. For man without family is considered transient, fit only to feed pigs and not to be trusted. He will lament the loss and come face to face with the reality of the situation when he says, I'm not fit to be called your son. Make me a hireling or a slave. But at the request, the father gives him what he wants. Culture would dictate that the father should refuse. The division of family wealth would come only at the very end of the father's life as he lay on his deathbed, giving out his blessing. You remember the stories of Abraham and Jacob. And in those moments, as the father lays dying, he would provide for the future of the family by giving out the goods. New Testament scholar Joachim Jeremiah points out that there were orderly, prescribed, and legal procedures available if the father chose to divide the family's property. He could. Each son would be given his portion based on birth order. 2 sons, a cultural rarity, would demand 2/3, 1/3 split. More sons, and the older still receives his portion, but the other sons increasingly less. And so to be born last in a large family was to have limited prospects outside of family structure. Even a second son would not receive enough to survive unless the estate was vast. Perhaps enough for a party-filled sojourn into a foreign country, but not much more. But if the father chose, the right of possession could be passed on, but not the right of disposition. That is, while the younger son could demand that his father give him his inheritance while he was still living, only the father could allow him to have everything without condition. Surely there were cases where the father was alive and chose to make his wishes known early, to read the will so no one would misunderstand what he wanted when he was gone. But it would be assumed that the father was still in control, making decisions on behalf of the family. And at the very least, the father would be angry and upset. What had he done to deserve such treatment by the younger son? 1 foot in the grave, according to the son, and here's a good push to get you there. Of all the things a father can hear, this had to cut right to his heart. How could his son, this son, say such a thing? Or at least the father should have been disappointed. Sometimes, in spite of our best efforts, children grow up and walk or run away from the very best of their upbringing. We try, but in stubborn rebellion they turn away. And we hang our heads, wondering what we should have done better. But more than anything, this father should have refused the request. No way, he should have said. How could you say such a thing to me, son? A good box of the ears, a shoe raised in anger. That was the only response that was reasonable. But this father in Jesus' tale is different. He is willing to give it all without condition. Jesus understates the reality when He says, and He divided His living between them. His living, all that he had. Later he would tell the older son, all that I have is yours. All that is mine is yours. Not strictly true, but in this moment, this father decided. He could have decided differently, but not this father. This father seems willing to the point of his own death to give and give and give. He simply gives the younger son what he wants. No argument ensues. And perhaps that's what upset the older son most. No discussion, just a request fulfilled. If that's what you want, the father says, that's what you get. In the 1960s, Nietzsche wrote, God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed Him. Yet His shadow still looms. How shall we comfort ourselves? The murderer of all murderers. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Thus began a movement in modern theology called the death of God, and our attempt, I believe, to free ourselves from God. God, give us what we have coming. God, we appreciate all You've done, all You've given, but now it's our time. It's my moment. God, I wish You were dead. The cover of the April 8, 1966 edition of Time magazine screamed, "Is God dead?" And the accompanying article addressed a growing atheism in America. But this was not really about atheism, at least in the strictest sense. It's more like a practical atheism. It's not that we don't believe God existed. It's instead that we have a growing sense that we don't need God anymore. Theologians argued over modern secular culture that lost all sense of the sacred, a lack of sacramental meaning, no transcendental purpose, the sense of God's providence and purpose. But simply put, for the modern mind, God was dead. An Emory theologian, Thomas Altizer, offered an even more radical theology of the death of God, concluding that when God had been made incarnate in Christ and imparted His Spirit, which remained in the world, that Jesus died, and that God had truly died when Jesus died on the cross. Some years ago, theologian Anthony Towney wrote a satire on the death of God called The Diary of the Late Great God. And in his book, he asked us to imagine that after God died, killed by theologians, a diary was found in God's belongings. And the entries in God's diary are wonderful satire on theology or the lack of it. The notion is that some people, for some of us, the characteristic is arrogance, unabashed arrogance and smugness, that we've been so blessed beyond measure, and yet we are so unwilling to give God credit. To put it another way, we live in a time in which it's very difficult to give God any glory, as if we have power over that. Instead, we just wish God were dead. And so in Exodus, Moses asked the Israelites to remember what God had done for them and not take for granted His blessings. It's so easy to forget and so hard to remember. And a lot of lessons of God are about remembering, not because God needs our praise or affirmation, but because we need not to forget. So in one entry in the diary, it reads, "In spite of my people's transgressions, no one else could have ever been more long-suffering or forgiving than I've been. I gave them all I could, a grand and glorious world in which to live, a world filled with beauty and resource." God continues, "I stood by them, and in their adversity I gave them my own son, and yet in their blindness and arrogance and ingratitude they committed the ultimate presumption. They presumed that their ways were better than mine, that the scheme of things I had was no longer necessary, that humankind had grown up, and that they no longer needed to be burdened down or held back by such a primitive or superstitious belief as God." Sadly, God says many people are not interested in believing in a God they cannot control or manipulate, who doesn't run things. For so many people, the kind of God they wanted just didn't exist. And if God did exist, He was completely irrelevant to their needs. And so we can wish God dead, but God cannot be put to death or controlled or manipulated. Instead, it is God's love that overflows into even the darkest places and the darkness of our very hearts. It's in such a world that God continues to reign, that God continues to love in spite of the evil that tries to grip and overcome the world and tries so fiercely to kill, to deny God even exists in favor of something else. I close with this. Evtushenko, a Russian poet, writes in his autobiography of a moment in 1944 when 20,000 German prisoners were being marched through the ice and snow, the streets of Moscow. Defeated, these once proud soldiers now staggered on the edge of death, and it was in that moment that an elderly Russian woman pushed through the police line and went up to the column of these ragged soldiers and shoved a crust of bread in the pocket of one of the soldiers who was so exhausted. And then suddenly, from all sides, women were running to those enemy soldiers, the very ones that had killed their loved ones, pushing bread and cigarettes and whatever else they had in their hands. A rare moment in human history. For instead of wishing them were dead, they gave them life. They offered things that were quickly gone, but the message stayed on, that the God imaged love and concern for those soldiers, that they would be freed to live on. If we make anything of our faith, it must be the very opposite of the arrogance of wishing God dead. Thanksgiving, gratitude, compassion, the acknowledgement that we came from God, that all we are is of God and all has a gift from God, rather than arrogantly declaring the death of God, or that God is no longer needed. We must proclaim that God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, the one who demonstrates in love of the Father how much we should show. At this time, let us listen to the closing anthem as they sing together.
Prayer shall be, but
I hope that you enjoyed Karen and Matt Cook as they sang together, two of our wonderful soloists at Church Street. We invite you to come to worship at Church Street on Sunday mornings. Our services are at 8:30 and 11 a.m. each Sunday. Sunday school begins at 9:40 for all ages. As always, you are welcome at Church Street as we seek to minister together. Today, as we've shared over the message of the prodigal, we begin this series, think again about what we would say to God, about how we respond to this gracious offer of the Father, that we would not be prodigal, but instead would say, I've come to my senses, God. I return to you. Go in peace.
Members and friends of Church Street United Methodist Church, your downtown church at the corner of Henley and Main, would like to thank you for joining Rejoice. Please send us your comments and suggestions, and be sure to tune in next Sunday at this same time for Rejoice.